Now, the rest of the story. March 1948, Cologne, Germany. A business conference was held in an Allies-only hotel. Oh, yes, post-war Germany was sometimes segregated thus, which meant on this particular occasion that German businessman Heinz Nordhoff required special authorization to attend the meeting. But anyway, Nordhoff was an engineer. He had recently been put in charge of a plant in Wolfsburg. The factory itself had been bombed so effectively by the Allies that even now manufacture could proceed only on days when it did not rain. Nordhoff believed in his product, but he realized that the company would most likely perish if not procured by a larger company, preferably an American company, and that's why this meeting had been scheduled, to unload the entire concern. On Nordhoff's side of the conference table that day was one Colonel C.R. Radcliffe, representing the British military government. On the other side, flanked by subordinate executives, sat Ernest Breech, chairman of the board of the American company, the one that Nordhoff had been courting. What was the deal, Breech wanted to know. Nordhoff tugged at his collar. The deal was the choicest imaginable, he replied. He was prepared to give his company, to give it away to the Americans, gratis, outright, all of it, free. The American subordinates grinned like hungry hyenas. The only thing left now, they thought, was for their boss to swallow this wounded wildebeest whole. But Chairman Breech was not smiling. Quote, "I do not think what we're being offered here is worth a damn," he said at last. I preserved his language precisely because it remains among the most famous quotes in the history of American industry. I do not think what we're being offered here is worth a damn. Well, promptly following its pronouncement, Heinz Nordhoff rose from the conference table and walked away. The months and years to come were dicey ones for his company. The Soviets offered to take it over, and would have, except their demand for more West German land as part of the bargain was flat out rejected. And then late in 1949, Nordhoff attempted to market his product directly to the United States and traveled there personally, armed with facts and figures and photographs, and he met with, as he put it, utter failure. How extraordinary that such a promise could have been so thoroughly overlooked. For the American manufacturer sitting across the conference table in that Allies-only hotel in Cologne, March 1948, was the Ford Motor Company. In fact, present at that meeting was none other than Henry Ford II, the grandson of the American industrialist whose aim was to make automobiles accessible to everybody. And the company nobody wanted, the car that Ford turned down, the bug-shaped little what's-it, which perhaps more than any other auto anywhere grows on you, the one that he was offered free, that's right, the product that Ford's chairman of the board once declared worthless was the Volkswagen. And one thing more, among the reasons that the Ford Motor Company turned its back on the Beetle so quickly, among the reasons was its eagerness to create and promote a people's car of its own, one perfectly suited to the tastes of the American motorist, a surefire success, Ford was so certain. And thus, employing the burgeoning science of market research, was born the Edsel, which you remember as the most spectacular flop in automotive history. Only now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. The Volkswagen that the Ford Motor Company turned down was produced for 65 years, from 1938 to 2003. It's one of the most iconic cars in automotive history, whether you like them or not. It's the longest of any single generation of automobile in history. Its production of over 21.5 million cars is the most of any car of a single platform. Now notice I said cars. The highest selling motor vehicle of all time is not even a car, not a truck, but a motorcycle. On October 19th, 2017, a ceremony was held at Honda's Kumamoto factory in Japan to mark the 100 millionth Super Cub. 100 millionth in 2017. Who knows how many they've produced since then. In 1982, at the peak of the Super Cub's popularity, Honda sold nearly 3 million of the bikes. 3 million in just 1 year. The Super Cub went into production in 1958, 20 years after the Volkswagen. Now, the Volkswagen was designed in the early 1930s when the leader of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, decided his country needed an expensive, simple, mass-produced car. A wagon for all folks. A Volkswagen. Production on the Volkswagen was planned to begin in the late 1930s, but the outbreak of war in 1939 put it on hold until after the end of the war. You're probably wondering why I'm not referring to it as the Beetle. Well, it wasn't officially named the Beetle until 1968. In the late 1950s, Ford compared their car roster to that of General Motors and Chrysler and recognized their need for a medium price range car. In 1955, Ford began testing a car they codenamed E-Car. Ford told people that the E stood for experimental, but they decided to call it the Edsel in honor of Edsel Ford. Now, Edsel Ford was the son of Henry Ford, the company's founder. He was born in 1893 in Detroit, Michigan. He was the only child of Henry and Clara Jane Ford. Henry named Edsel after one of his closest friends, Edsel Rudeman. Now, Edsel Rudeman became a doctor and a professor of pharmacy at Vanderbilt University. In 1926, that's Dr. Rudeman, went to work for Ford and supervised Ford's nutritional research in connection with soybeans. Henry Ford and Edsel Rudeman were lifelong friends. So when Henry and Clara's son was born, Henry honored Dr. Rudeman by naming his son after him. Edsel Ford was groomed to eventually take over the company, and Edsel absolutely loved tinkering with cars. After college, Edsel went to work for Ford full-time. Henry Ford had designed cars for the everyday man, which were kind of utilitarian vehicles. But Edsel liked the flashier style of cars, sports cars, as young men often do. In 1915, Edsel became secretary of the company and married Eleanor Clay the same year. Together they had 4 children, Henry Ford II, Benson Ford, Josephine Ford, and William Ford. In 1919, Edsel became the president of Ford Motor Company. Almost as soon as he became president of the company, Edsel began pushing for a more modern car to replace the Model T. Although Edsel was president of the company, Henry Ford still reigned supreme and refused. But sales of the Model T were steadily declining. Customers were buying cars made by Ford's competitors. Finally, Henry Ford realized that they had to do something. They came up with another model, the Model A. While designing the Model A, Henry allowed Edsel to design the car's body. In December 1927, the Model A was introduced and was hugely successful. Prices for a Model A ranged from $385 for a Roadster to $1,400 for the town car. Now, adjusted for inflation, the Roadster would cost about $8,000 today, and the town car would be about $29,000. Ford sold over 4 million Model A's during its 4-year production run, and it was replaced by the Model B in 1932. Edsel was an innovator who introduced many lasting changes within the company and within the auto industry itself. In 1922, he led the company to purchase the Lincoln Motor Company. 10 years later, Edsel had Ford designer Bob Gregory design this aluminum boat-tailed Model 40 Special Speedster. It was powered by Ford's brand new V8 engine. In 1938, Edsel founded and named a new brand of cars to bridge the gap between the Ford and Lincoln model lines. Edsel named the new brand after the Roman god Mercury. Edsel was responsible for the Lincoln Zephyr and the Lincoln Continental. Edsel modernized their cars. For example, Edsel led the way in introducing hydraulic brakes to cars, which is standard in the industry today. We still use this. Before this change, brakes were mechanical. When you pushed on the brake pedal, it moved a rod, which moved another rod, which pushed a pad onto the hub of the wheel. There was no stopping on a dime. Edsel and Henry often disagreed on major decisions. Henry had no qualms about humiliating Edsel in public, even though Edsel was the president of the company. Now, in addition to the stress that he and any other company president would have been under, he also had the stress of working under his domineering father, which took its toll. I'll explain what I mean in just a moment. Edsel was an advocate for aviation. Edsel was determined to develop airplanes despite Henry's objections. Ford's U.S. Post Office airmail carrier was a huge success. And when World War II broke out, Ford was able to provide airplanes quicker than other manufacturers who had to start from scratch. During the war, Edsel suffered from stomach pains, which he learned was stomach cancer. Surgery to remove the cancer was unsuccessful. On May 26, 1943, 49-year-old Edsel Bryant Ford died as a result of his stomach cancer. 2 years after Edsel's death, Henry Ford II, Edsel's eldest son, became president of Ford. Henry Ford II objected to naming the E-car after his father, but eventually gave in. Ford Motor Company assured its investors that the details of Edsel's styling and specifications were the result of a sophisticated market analysis and research and development effort, which would essentially guarantee their broad acceptance by the buying public when the car was introduced. Well, the Edsel was revealed to the public on September the 4th, 1957, what the company called E-Day. The car was heavily promoted and even had a top-rated television special called The Edsel Show. In the first year, 1958, Ford sold over 68,000 Edsels in the United States and Canada. Although it was below what Ford had expected, it was the second largest launch of any new car brand at the time. But by the end of 1958, sales were declining. For the most part, car buyers liked everything about the car except its exterior styling. They liked the innovations, which included a rotating dome speedometer. In other cars, the speedometer was either a horizontal strip or a round dial. It also had warning lights based on aircraft designs for low oil level, parking brake engaged, and engine overheating. You know that pesky check engine light? This was its origin. The Edsel had no cruise control, but it had a speed warning light on the speedometer which illuminated if the driver exceeded a preset speed. The transmission on some models was controlled by push buttons mounted in the steering wheel. Those were great innovations, but most people thought the car was just plain ugly. People mostly complained about the Edsel's grille. They compared it to a toilet seat, a horse collar, and even a vagina. Ford projected that they would sell 200,000 Edsels per year, but they were nowhere close. Despite their best efforts, Ford only sold about 116,000 Edsels in total. Ford canceled the Edsel in 1959 after they had built 2,846 Edsels for the 1960 year model. But that's not the end of the Edsel story. The Edsel has had a resurgence in interest in the past few decades due to scarcity. With so few of them around these days, less than 10,000, their value continues to rise. That grille that kept a lot of people from buying the car in the late 50s is the thing most people point and smile about these days. It's instantly recognizable as an Edsel. Now, if you go to a car show and see one, just wait around a few minutes and see how long it takes for you to overhear someone comparing it to something else. What do you think it looks like? I'm Brad Dyson. Thanks for watching. And now you know the rest of the story.